Hello, everyone, and welcome to Hydra's Den. Today we're going to be talking about villains and villain motivations. I'm joined by Trent again. Hey.
Hey, hey everybody.
Okay, so what I'm planning to go over today is just general points to remember for new DMs who are trying to figure out how to improve their villains, or those who haven't actually made a villain yet and they want to have some good general tips. If you want to talk at some point to us directly or get some advice from other DMs, I keep a Discord server open. The link should be on the YouTube channel in our YouTube description. I'll post a link in the Twitch chat at some point too. I'm happy to hear from any people who decide to come in, so pop on by and say hello if you feel like you found something useful. Okay, with that out of the way, let's talk a bit about villains. So, if this is going to work, yep, it's going to work. Okay, so villains, the 101, really, everyone knows what a villain is, right? Shouldn't have to explain that too much. Everyone has at least a few favorite villains too. In some ways, villains are more crucial to your plot than the heroes are going to be, since villains are going to be the catalyst for any conflict in your story, and much of the story will be shaped around their personality and ideals. So, a violent villain is going to make a violent story, a clever villain is going to make a clever story. Now, I've personally, one of the reasons why I'm talking about this is I've seen this stupid little villain tier list thing floating around for a while that tries to sort villains by their motivations. I don't know if you've seen it, Trent. It's the one where it's like Elder God tier with the villains whose motivations are arguably better than the heroes, and goes through all the different ones, and there's a bunch of memes of it.
I haven't seen that one, but I've seen like the chaotic good, chaotic evil shit
Okay.
applied to villain tiers.
I'll send it to you at some point. But the general idea is that it says that villains whose motives are better, arguably better than the heroes are Elder God tier, and villains who simply strive for power or commit evil for the sake of evil, they're like the worst tier. And personally, I disagree with that. That's a big thing. I disagree with that for several reasons. And the first one is that a villain is only as good as their writing. Regardless of your motivations, a villain should, of course, have strong and recognizable personality. They should have a strong, sort of mission statement. But they don't always need to be some sort of sympathetic figure who's maybe better off than the players. There are tons of memorable villains that are just complete jerks or pure evil. Um, there's Batman's Joker or Sauron of the Lord of the Rings. There's a bunch. I could keep going, but those are two good examples. Um, so while the Joker is a well shown and very clearly defined individual, Sauron's a bit more vague, in terms of how he is in Lord of the Rings. He's more shown through the way his henchmen do things. He's just kind of, I don't even know what his thing is. It's like he wants to cover the world in darkness or some stuff.
Uh, wasn't it that he wanted to enslave everybody underneath him or something like? I haven't read the books in a
Yeah.
long time. It's been longer since I've seen the movies.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I'm sure if we went over and read the books again and played close attention, we'd learn some greater motivation or mechanism behind Sauron's plotting. But the general impression that most people are going to get is that he's just kind of this bad guy, right? He looks cool, he does evil things, and he's got great henchmen. Um, and that's fine. That's the thing. That's fine. These two villains that I gave, Joker and Sauron, they represent sort of two extremes in defining your villains. You've got a villain that's always there and very clearly in the moment. He's an active agent of destruction, the Joker. And you've on the other side, you've got the evil overlord, the villain who sits at the back and known through the things that he does to the world rather than what he directly does. Um, so we're going to talk a bit more about henchmen and followers a bit later. But it's important to note that in both these cases, despite the fact that they're pretty simple villains, they're memorable villains. They're not bad villains by any means. So that's just a sort of direct shot at that stupid different tiers of villains based on the motivation chart.
My personal favorite villain, or one of them rather, is Professor Fate from the Great Race movies, and he's the quintessential mustache twirling villain. And it can be fun just to have ridiculously motivated villains like that, or Dick Dastardly or whatever his name was in the Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons.
Oh yeah, no, I love them. It's the magnificent bastard sort of stereotype, and honestly, those are just as great. And people, I don't know. People tend to think that because Marvel did Thanos recently, they did Thanos as a nice, relatable character. Or other villains like him. Oh, your villain has to have a very personal, very identifiable relationship. No, you don't have to have that. You can have someone who's just an asshole. You can have someone who's just exists to cause chaos, but you still have to put some work in. Like, they can be good or they can be bad. It's a bit harder when they're just working for chaos, because then you've got to compensate for the fact that they're not very complex in terms of their motivations. So, in the case of your particular game, and when I say your, I mean whoever's the new DM's watching this. You may not have a Joker or Sauron, but you still want a good villain that actually feels like a real, I don't know, being, for lack of a better word. So what's important is going to be shaping this villain's personality and his motivations. So these are big parts of making a villain feel less like kind of a plot point and more like some actual piece of the story. So, first point I'd always remember when making villains' motivation is going to be a simple rule. In life, everybody is seeking that reward. They're trying to find some sort of pleasure out of what they're doing. Doesn't matter what you're doing, your goal is ultimately going to be some kind of reward. How you find that reward is actually pretty important here. I'm reminded of the D&D alignments where you have good, neutral, and evil. It's actually a pretty easy one to relate directly into this reward system, where I would say a good person is someone who finds pleasure or reward in helping others. A neutral person is someone who finds pleasure or reward in helping themselves. And an evil person is someone who finds pleasure or reward in harming others. This is how when I'm saying that, though, I'm referring to how the person's sort of going to personally have their alignment. It's a bit of an iffy thing. It's not clear cut. Some people would probably disagree and have their own definitions, but that's my sort of view on it. I don't know, Trent, if you think that it works anything.
Like personal motivations?
Yeah,
right?
as a drive for personal motivation.
I mean, that's you can have characters with greater motivations, but sometimes selfish ones are the best reasons to have a character doing something.
Yeah. But the thing is that but pleasure isn't always a very clear-cut thing. Like, it's not always, wealth or having sex or, whatever that is, or kicking a baby. Sometimes pleasure is actually a bit weird, I find. So, an example would be some find pleasure in the act of denying themselves the reward. The idea of restraining oneself from whatever would be the easy path of pleasure. It can be just as satisfying as the act itself. This is where puritanical systems find motivation. This is where a lot of paladins come from. There's a sort of righteous pleasure or reward from the idea that you're following a code, So, some find, and on the other hand, some people find pleasure in control. Being able to deny or allow something to happen. That's another kind of pleasure. And, some find pleasure in being recognized as owning wealth or material wealth or power. That's important. Actually, I'm going to note that the recognition in that matter, in the matters of greed and pride, it's very often the fact that people are recognizing that they have all that stuff. A miser who owns all the gold in the world is not really that important, and he's going to be a poor and sad man if nobody actually cares about gold, Trent?
I mean, if nobody cares about gold and he just cares, you can always change his motivation to the aggravation of power. Money doesn't exactly have to be the long and the short of.
That's exactly what I mean. In the case of if someone has a greedy motivation, your greed or your lust for power or whatever is only as significant as people's recognition of it. If that makes sense. Trent.
No, I get it.
Yeah. So in our DM's case, when you're writing your villain, just remember the villain is probably not someone who believes that they're doing is wrong. As I said, they're someone who's probably seeking some sort of pleasure or reward, but they're also someone who does not believe they are the villain. People will try to find all sorts of ways to justify their actions, even if their actions are universally despised. They may develop a martyr mentality, where they believe any sins or failings on their part will be for the greater good. They'll take everyone else's burdens and just be a complete and utter jerk just for the best. It's for the best. Or they'll develop a persecution complex where they take disagreement about some aspect of their actions and project it to their whole character. These types can be very dangerous as villains, since the idea that if they get you'll often see these where they get criticized and they lash out very violently because they take it as they'll take it people take it personally and they get nasty. It's at the end of the day, it's a very human thing to do, and even the most inhuman characters will often sort of display these types of complexes, motivations, whatever you want to call it. And honestly, even if the villain comes to the conclusion eventually that they are wrong, what they're doing is wrong, you got to remember that one of the strongest motivators for people that are messing things up to continue messing things up is the fact that they don't want to admit they're wrong. A villain might have screwed up super hard. They might have finally come to the realization that they are the problem and that they have completely and utterly just ruined everything. But they might keep on going because admitting that they screwed up would be so much harder than staying the course. What's your take on it, Trent?
I mean, again, you don't necessarily have to have like a higher motivation for a character. The mustache twirling, just evil for the sake of being evil character always works. But when you're talking about characters with greater motivations or even justifying themselves as not being evil, it makes me think a lot about one of the key villains that we had in your campaign for a long time that kept hounding us as a party.
Yeah.
And he convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't evil because there was a scientific bent to it, while we were all convinced of the opposite. But I assume you're going to be talking about that more in depth in a bit.
Oh yeah, no. Well, I wasn't exactly going to touch on him. If you're talking about Herbert, I assume.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. And in that case, that was a character where he's a necromancer who views things from a purely sort of scientific viewpoint. Almost an engineering viewpoint of simply necromancy isn't unethical because you're simply constructing something. You're just making a golem type creature. The fact that you're using the parts of the dead, the fact that you're desecrating the dead, didn't matter to him anymore. So it's an example where someone has basically they've basically found a way to justify their actions, even though desecration of the dead is a universally despised action. If in the case of this necromancer, if he can just find a way to tell himself that it's not that big of a problem because what he's doing is doing all these discoveries, all the discoveries he's making regarding this are just so infinitely more useful. And if in his view, he can sort of just kind of wipe it away as it's not a huge problem, even though everyone else is going to tell him that. If you can get there, then you've actually made a pretty solid villain, because it's a villain that's not easy to break in terms of the players poking out a flaw in them, and it's a villain who is going to be very stalwart in their views, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we got someone in the chat actually. The ethical ramifications of necromancy in my world come down to one distinction: are you using a soul or are you programming some spare parts? Yeah, that's and that's another way to look at it. Thanks, Maliki, but a lot of people are still going to look at it from a different way, because you have to consider the common folk don't really like it when you come digging up someone's old pappy's dead body and turning it into a flesh golem. So it's something where they actually will not view that they're doing wrong. It's an example of a good motivation. They don't think that they're being wrong, but the average person's probably going to frown upon them. It's society's expectation versus a personal expectation.
As someone who typically plays paladins and knights, I think if someone were to resurrect my dead grandfather, I'd be pretty pissed whether or not his soul was in there.
Yeah, it's a matter of honor. And the Maliki says there was a tinkerer gnome who didn't think he was in the wrong because he was putting souls into Modron he made. Oh, yeah. I'm not going to try and pronounce that one, but Tam Cruise. Okay, I'll try. His name was Tam Cruise Mathis. Am I missing something?
That sounds about right.
Tom Cruise. Oh, there
Tom,
it is.
That's hilarious.
Oh, you're terrible.
I think the idea of a gnome Tom Cruise is fantastic.
Gnomes in general. But yeah, no, there's a lot of stuff you could do with your motivation. Motivation's a great way to sort of develop a character and try and find out why they tick, how they tick, and how you're going to give it to the other person. And he had that. Tom Cruise had a shield guardian named Elron Hubbard. Oh, this guy with his Elron Hubbard. I get it, Elron Hubbard. So let's move on though, because honestly, we could talk about motivations for basically forever. But the real points that you need to get, the real essentials there to remember are: make sure your villain doesn't think he's the villain, because you know anyone who thinks that they're the villain usually doesn't stay the villain for very long and is very easily convinced otherwise. Unless you want to make some sort of tragic, brooding Drizzt clone, then all the power to you. And the other thing to consider is that everybody, and I do mean everybody, is trying to get their kicks in life. They're trying to find some sort of reward. And this is my personal argument once again, but I'd view someone who doesn't actually look for a reward in life is probably someone who's just kind of they don't have any drive,
It's a sort of character gets retired quickly on in the campaign.
Yeah, exactly. Because if a character is sitting there and saying, "What am I doing here?" then your answer to that is you're leaving because you're not relevant to the campaign anymore. Always make sure that they have some stakes in it. Always make sure they have some drive in it. So from there, we're going to move on to once you've got that point, how do you make a villain who's menacing or a villain who's memorable? Now this is where things get fun, because you've got your villain all dressed up, you got their motivations primed and ready, but how do you take it one step further and make this villain into something that the players will remember? There's a lot of ways to do this. There's a lot of classic sort of stereotypes or archetypes that people will go into, like the terrifying tyrants, or the magnificent bastard. We talked about the Dick Dastardly type. One of my favorite villains is this magnificent bastard type, who has plagued my players, including Trent here, by simply being a rogue who is very difficult to kill and is very, very bombastic.
Luisimo the Immortal, isn't it?
Luisimo the Immortal. Oh my goodness, I love that boy. Just because it's always fun to have someone like that. But and they'll be memorable. At least I think so. Trent, you can tell me if you don't think he's anything, but
I mean, my character's sworn a death pact against the guy, so
yeah, it's definitely going somewhere with that, because and that's how you know when your players start doing stuff like that. That's how you know you've got a good villain going. So some of the nice, easy things to do though are going to be there's a few. Let's go over them. So these are just little plot twists you can do, little tricks, and these will tend to bring out a villain's strong points. So the first and easy way to do it is to kill the dog. That's what I'm going with as the term for it. But the idea is this: it's NPC murder. A nice, strong NPC murder. So regardless of your villain style, whether he's a magnificent bastard or a terrifying Terminator or whatever, evil overlord, they are going to leave a trail of dead bodies, unless they have sworn to a code of no murder. In which case they'll probably leave a trail of, really depends. They'll leave a trail of something. If they're a non-violent magnificent bastard, they might leave a trail of robbed homes. They might leave a trail of, I don't know, wanton sabotage and destruction. Regardless, though, they're going to leave a trail of something, and dead bodies, to be honest, are probably the best one, unless your character is one of the few that doesn't need it. So some of the dead are going to need to pop up right on your party's doorstep. And the easiest way to do that, to be honest, is if the villain has an army, have them kill the innkeep, kill the captain of the town guard, kill that nice little flower girl down the street. Doesn't matter who you're going to kill, just around the beginning, somebody's got to die. When you have that first sort of plot hook of this guy is a bad guy, you're going to need him to kill somebody. So the best way to do this is there's a little order to it. First, you present the NPC to the players. You'll give them a nice little character, personality. You need to make them likable, but not too strong a character. Just a lovely, innocent bystander. You can make them as a nice, reliable innkeep that the players are getting the vibe they'll be coming back to. It could be, as I said, a little flower girl in the corner who hands out flowers to the players, or tries to sell the players flowers every time they go by, right? nice little orphan or something like that. Or the captain of the town guard, who's just a nice bro type character and is making friends with everyone. So you get that person, you get the players a little bit attached to them, then you send them away on a small quest, or a mission, or whatever is necessary to move them away from this NPC, just for long enough that that you can excuse what's about to happen. So when they come back, depending on the context, it's going to be nasty. So if it's evil armies, they might return to Burning Village under attack, or perhaps a gang of thieves roughing up the victim for information, or whatever excuse you want. The list keeps going. There's all sorts of reasons why you can set up NPC abuse. Now, the players are going to try and save the person, and this is where it's a tragic effect. You have either they just made it too late to save the poor person, or perhaps they make it there just in time to hear the final words of the dead or of the dying. Whatever way it goes, you got to make it sad. You got to ham it up, and you will give the players a personal vendetta, like nothing else. The players will not forget it. It could be, I have heard stories about like the most innocent little random NPC that the DM didn't think anyone would care about, and they killed them off, and the players swore eternal vengeance. Trent, do you have any situations like that?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Well, situations where you've had an NPC get killed off that you didn't really think was important, but the players just went into an absolute uproar over it.
I can't remember any from Dungeons and Dragons, but Bloodborne, there's the one little girl in the house that you get the her mother's brooch for, and that little story always made me feel quite upset for her and the whole thing. It elicited an emotional reaction at the very least.
Yeah, that's a good example. Because it's a good using children's an excellent way to do it. It's gonna sound a bit like I'm sort of potential psychopath here, but no, definitely children, the infirm, the old, the frail. My favorite would definitely be the town guard, and there's the infamous sort of quip in action movies where he was only 2 weeks away from retirement. It's that sort of character that when you kill them off is going to get the players really riled up about your villain. It's a good thing to keep in mind in general, though. So, one thing to keep in mind, though, I just remembered. A final note. If your setting has any sort of healing magic, be very careful with this. Because if the players can instantly restore wounds, they might ruin your NPC's tragic death before your NPC has the chance to say their final goodbyes. They will probably run in, slap a heal, and then suddenly all the tension and drama has been sucked right out of your scene. Because, you can just imagine the very awkward situation where you have this old man, he's on the verge of death, he's trying to tell his last words, and he's now healed. It just kind of ruins the scene. So make sure in a situation like that, you've got a good way to keep them dead. That's what I'm gonna say. And Maliki,
you can just pull a Final Fantasy VII and have it happen in an irreversible cutscene, or you can do something a little more clever, like Lord of the Rings, where they have the mortal blades that are incurable except for very specific types of magic that you can't just have on you at any time.
Yeah, a nasty one I would do sometimes is cursed wounds from particularly evil entities. It's a cursed wound, and oh boy, that's going to be fun to try and heal. You have to go through all your heal checks and everything. Maliki says, Necromancer has a small pack of undead puppies. A little girl's dog goes missing, and they find a zombie doggo with its name tag. Yeah, that's a good one, actually. That's a great way. It's the innocent, really. It's the idea of the villain targeting the innocent, and that type of stuff gets players so riled up because you kill the dog. Well, it's exactly what I said. Kill the dog, and you could do it quite literally. You can do it metaphorically, but as long as you're breaking, I guess it's the idea of something that the players were kind of sinking into as a nice little comfortable situation. You're breaking them out of it, and they'll send them out on their adventure.
You've heard an animal and a kid. That would I know that a situation like that would make me furious in real life. So
yeah, and it's no different in game. It also, of course, will make the players a bit more invested in your NPCs, hopefully. Maliki adds cursed wound or inflicted with a plague that effectively lowers their constitution permanently over a few days until they die. If they're revived, they still have 1 to 2 con. Yeah, no, it's a good point. If you're especially if you're in a D&D setting where to revive someone is very expensive, setting someone with something like that, and suddenly you've got the players got to ask themselves, are they willing to throw 10k gold on this random old innkeep? It becomes a tough challenge, and it probably will guide them more towards swearing revenge rather than getting you stuck in a side story of it's time to revive this random innkeep I spent 2 lines on and I didn't think anyone would really care about, because that's always fun to deal with. So point number 2, to make a villain into a real terror is by giving them a way to flex. I've heard this described as the Worf effect. I don't know if you know that one, Trent.
Worf from Star Trek.
Yeah, the Worf effect. I don't know if you heard about that.
I know the character. I've never heard of that.
So the Worf effect was something that went on for a while or that the fans gave in Star Trek, where whenever a big villain appeared, he would go up and Worf would do something. Worf was this very big tough guy. He's the master of blades. I didn't actually watch Star Trek, but I did know about this little sort of fan thing. And the idea is that Worf is this big muscle-bound warrior dude. And so a big villain would come in, and Worf would go in to fight him, and Worf would immediately get his ass kicked. Every time. And it would be, oh, look how big and terrible this villain is. He beat up Worf. The problem became that it happened too many times, and suddenly Worf no longer looks that tough if every villain takes their chance to beat on him. Maliki adds, the head barmaid walks in with a DNR. Yeah, do not resuscitate. Yep, that's also a good way to convince them to not revive them if the NPC themselves do not want to revive them. But what I mean, though, with this flex is that typically the way you do this is you provide a tough challenge to the players, okay? So you provide a monster.
Hydra.
A Hydra, sure.
No, hold on. I was going to say Phoenix is saying that you didn't get an invitation from you.
Yeah, we'll have him in a bit later. How about?
Fair.
I'll just send him a message. Yeah, if you want to let him know that we're kind of in the middle of it now. He was a little bit slow to come in, and since you're okay, I thought, might as well go with this. So, yeah. So, as I misinterpreted you saying, yes, a Hydra is an example of a really tough monster. It could be a dragon. It could be whatever you want. So the players have an absolutely tough challenge with this whatever, only to have the villain come by and blow away a similar or harder challenge without breaking a sweat. This is a tricky one because if you don't set this scene properly for the villain, the players will just accuse you of making a stupid Mary Sue overpowered whatever, insert insult here. But the idea is to set up a power differential between the two of you, between the villain and the players. This type of power setting is usually going to be done in a longer campaign where the players will have a chance to grow stronger eventually. It provides a concrete way to establish exactly how strong the villain is compared to the player in terms of like factors of strength without the players actually having to fight the villain. Because this is what I've seen and heard of enough times where people want to show how strong and cool their villain is, so they sick them on the players, and the players, get their asses handed to them. But being players, players unfortunately have the tenacity of a honey badger, where even if you cut off both their arms, they will come shrieking at you and try to bite off your kneecaps. So what was originally supposed to be a little cutscene of, oh, look how strong this villain is, turns into a premature death for several players who would not back down because they refused to ever back down, which is something that Trent has done. If you remember,
I've had several characters killed because I refused to back down from fights.
Yeah. So then this is something I actually had to learn, is that because players will not back down, when you want to show off a villain's strength, Instead, it is much better to have them put them up against something against a challenge. So as I said, it would be if the players defeat a baby dragon and they had a huge hard time doing it, the players later find that the mother was killed by the villain. If the players are trying to get past this golem and it's a really tough challenge, they go by later and they find that the villain has gone through and ripped apart all the golems and has just blown his way straight through. Maliki from the comments adds he will almost always have the characters walk into the aftermath of the villain's show of power and have them fight a minion of him make that fight super hard. That's an excellent way, and that is exactly what I'm talking about, Maliki. The idea that your villain should leave destruction in his wake, that intimidates the players. It's going to be something that the players remember, and it's going to be something great for the players because it will show them just how much they've progressed too once they get to the point where they can actually fight the villain. Because at the beginning, and this is a nice it's always nice when the villain does an off-screen stuff, because the villain can do whatever he wants when it's off-screen. That's when a fun thing as a DM is that you can make up this scene of absolute carnage with blood and body parts thrown across the room, and a dragon's half is thrown on one side and the other side is, straight through a wall or something like that. That if you tried to do that mechanically, it wouldn't work. It wouldn't just have the same impact. But if the players walk in on the aftermath of that and, oh yeah, the villain did this, then the players get to have that moment of, okay, he's a tough boy. What do you think, Trent?
I mean, that's a pretty standard way to handle those things. I think I know a lot of video games that deals with stuff like that. You show up. What's a recent one? Metal Gear Rising: Revengeance. When you meet Jetstream Sam, is it? And he kicks your ass in. Like, you just took down a Metal Gear Ray, and you feel on top of the world, and this guy's beating you with like no effort required. And the guy, I don't even think he was really all that cybernetic. He
was, but it's mostly his skill is different than yours. And yeah, no, that's a good point. Although one thing I would add is that the one thing is that that doesn't translate quite as well over to to tabletop RPGs, only because imagine if when Raiden runs out of health, he kept trying to go and he just kept going, and he just would not stay down, and that he got his head decapitated because the poor guy didn't know how to say I'm done. Then you've got basically a situation with players. That's how players roll.
I think that is actually how it went in the game. Didn't he have to get saved by someone else?
Something like that. I think he gets knocked off or something. I don't remember. But the point is that players, when they do that, players will get very salty. I've noticed that. Players get very salty if you give them an unwinnable encounter. I talked about this in a previous video where I talked about the idea that you have to sort of convey the danger of a villain, of an unwinnable encounter, so that the players know to run. And if you don't convey it, then players will kill themselves. They'll kill themselves on anything and everything. And Maliki adds that this next session, my players are going to get back from hunting down an adult dragon only to find the leaders and rulers across the continent have lost the heirs to their companies and seats of power, just slaughtered in the Lord Mayor's house. Turns out the dragon is a distraction away from the secret, secure meeting. Yeah, no, that's a fine thing because it also shows off, your villain's cleverness. And that actually segues quite nicely into my final point. The final way to keep your villains as a real threat is by constantly finding ways to remind the players of your villain's existence and presence in the world around them. So, a lord of an evil army, for an example, will inspire terror across the land. That will not go unnoticed by the rest of the denizens of your kingdom. The players may hear word that the villain has destroyed nearby cities. People in general will, talk about how they've had so much hard time, I don't know, getting merchants to go by because they keep getting ransacked. And generally people will have everyone will have some sort of problem related to it. On the other hand, a non-army villain may simply garner their own set of rumors as they travel. The level of these rumors are going to depend on how destructive the villain is. Where a thief's heist might make local news to every place they travel to, whereas a rampaging savage will make local property damage, on the other hand. walking in and seeing half the town destroyed and asking, what happened here? Oh, it's that villain. Well, that's a very clear-cut way to remind people of this presence. And the nice thing about this is how it's first off, it's world building. Having the NPCs interact with the villain's presence gives both the NPCs more I don't know, relatability, makes them more believable, but it also gives the villain more validity. It provides honestly a great impact overall for how the players will view both the villain and the world. Trent, anything to add to that?
Not particularly. I think you covered it pretty well.
Yeah, thanks. So the idea is just the three things to remember are make your villain kill people, because Zach kill the dog. Make your villain flex, and then make the rest of the people know that he's there, and make the rest of the people talk about it. So you do these three things, and honestly, you'll usually get a villain that people will be talking about for a while. That's the hope, at least. So, from here, let's move into henchmen and minions. So, this is a fun one. In general, a good majority of villains will have their own henchmen. In general, if you're trying to figure out what to do with your henchmen, first place to start is that your henchmen should have a theme that either matches or fits in somehow with the main big bad's theme. Okay, so even if they naturally clash, such as a vampire lord leading orcs, you can use armor, aesthetics, or even the disposition of both the villain and his minions to form a cohesive theme. This will also connect into why the two are working together, because you have to remember, henchmen are people of their own. They've got their own inspirations, even if they're going to be faceless mooks for the most part. Why the minions follow the villain? It should be evident from the villain themselves. In the case of a vampire leading orcs, if the orcs are savage and brutal and only respect strength, then the vampire needs to be far more monstrous and powerful than the orcs. He doesn't necessarily have to be savage in the same way, but he has to keep sort of this edge of brutality that makes it very clear why the orcs follow him. In the case of monstrous or mindless minions, the Zerg Swarm, the mindless puppeteered, brain-controlled cultist, or whatever, these themes will usually be related by the idea of, as I said with the Zerg, the idea of an insect sort of faction, where you'll have a queen and their workers, or you'll have a puppet master and his thralls. You'll find some sort of binding together, and typically it'll be, for the case of a puppet master, it'll be some sort of connecting tissue of some sort of ritualistic thing, perhaps on the servants, or if it's a biological agent that's controlling them, it will be some sort of symptom. This, and whatever symptom this is, should be very obvious on the puppet master. In other words, if the victims are all being controlled by mind-controlling spores that give you a green spot on your head, then the main puppet master needs to have many, many green spores as a sort of theme on him. It helps connect the two together, if that makes sense. So there is one other perspective I have to bring up. I do not like this one personally that much, but the idea is that you could also go for them completely clashing. This often goes poorly, as it tends to lead to the lull random category of villains, but if that's your goal, then go for it. However, in that case, make sure that there's a very hard clash between your villains and your minions. Sauron can lead the Hello Kitty Muppets, but those Muppets better be as useless and ineffectual as Sauron is dangerous and efficient. If your Sauron, in this case, isn't tough enough, then your punchline falls flat. The greater the distance between, in the case of clashing villains and minions, the greater the comedic effect, if that makes sense. Getting down to the brass tacks of designing your henchmen or minions, and Trent, feel free to pop in anytime if you want to talk about this too. But typically, in my view, you'll have multiple levels of minions within the villain faction, and they'll be generally divided into 3 tiers. So, first off, you got the lower tier minions. These are going to be the mooks. These are going to be the generics. Unless the setting is heavily skewed against the players, these underlings will not be overly challenging on their own. Difficulty should scale with the players, of course, but the lowest trash tier mooks should be easily dispatched since they are meant to be disposable pawns. Don't overdevelop them. You don't have to work too hard on them. And with the exception of where the theme calls for it, these mooks should probably get maybe a few sentences worth of description, then devolve into jobbers that the players get to beat on. They're probably going to be dumb, crude, and they'll probably end up as fodder for the abusive villain to take out his anger on. Yeah, Trent?
I was just going to say, I don't remember the specific example, but it's the reverse of that. I mean, you did touch on it, where it's the villain who's hopelessly incompetent, and it's the henchmen who are like skilled and basically holding the entire thing together.
Yeah.
And I wish I could remember what that example is from.
Well, yeah, and that's another example of the clashing between the villain and his henchmen. But in that case, the henchmen must be deadly competent. They must be like, the more competent and efficient they are, the more incompetent and foolish the villain is. You've got to, since doing the clashing, the idea is to create a comedic effect. He says, Maliki says Venture Bros. Is that perhaps what you're thinking of?
Right, yeah, no, with the Monarch and Henchman 21 after he becomes Henchman 1.
Yep, Henchman 23 and the Monarch.
Was it 23? I thought 23 was the...
Maliki says them.
Oh, yeah, it was 23. Yeah, sorry.
Maliki also wants to add, regardless of the power of minions, you can always introduce small pockets of personality, especially in the internal leadership structure. This is actually what I was going to get to next, which is that the lowest tier of minions should be mooks. They should be, whatevers. Beatable, your orcs, your goblins, your cultists. God, they don't even get names for themselves, these poor buggers. But they're jobbers. Now, the next tier are the elites, or the specialists. There are many roles in this sort of category, from magic-using supports, like shamans and the like, to brutish squad leaders, to the elusive snipers or assassins. This tier serves to mix things up for your player. It keeps them on their toes, and it gives the villain's followers more of a feel of a cohesive force with many different characters rather than a faceless horde. In combat encounters, you're going to sprinkle these guys sparingly, or if it's a special encounter, you will use maybe a force entirely consistent of one of these types of guys or a few of these guys. Either way, they will get more development than the rest of your horde. Maybe once or twice each they'll get a little scene. That when they appear, you give a little bit of flavor description of them, perhaps in such a way that it hints or shows off their key abilities. Then they'll probably never get their spotlight again once again. So think of special infected in a zombie game, or the goblin shamans who lead the tribe, or those pieces in chess that aren't pawns and they aren't the king or queen. If your game was a meal, I like to think of these guys as the garnishes, the seasonings, and whatever drink you have with the meal. Like, everybody's going to know about these. They happen all the time in video games. If you have any examples of sort of fun, sort of elite units you've used, Trent.
Sorry?
If you have any examples of any sort of fun elite type units you've used, feel free to, key in.
Not necessarily an elite type unit that I've used yet, but for the one shot that I'm building, I have the idea for... I mean, the villain, he's not really a villain, he's just an antagonist for the first part of it, but I was going to give the players the options to hire a bunch of NPCs to help them out, and one of the guys that they were going to be able to hire is going to be so hopelessly incompetent despite presenting himself. He's going to be a very, very good liar and horribly incompetent at everything else. The idea was that if they picked him, he created some fairly humorous situations that wouldn't be altogether detracting to the party's efforts.
Not exactly what I was talking about, but it's still, you know what? No, it still works. Minions for the players could be just have the same categories as minions for the villain, especially if you start to get into larger numbers of recruits. Having specific ones that stand out will always be a memorable situation. Myleiki adds that he ran a short Kuotoa mini dungeon crawl that had basic Kuotoa, a priest, berserkers from the monster manual, and they were all working for a bone naga in an attempt to sacrifice the kobolds to resurrect sleeping kraken from a large deep lake nearby. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's the idea. You got the basic mooks there, You've got your elites, which are the priests and the berserkers, and then you've got the Bone Naga, which is the villain in this case. Or you could call the Kraken the villain. I'd say the Kraken is more of the goal, or like the actual final sort of risk. It's the objective more than an actual entity that you have to worry about. Now, the final tier is of the henchman menagerie is the named mooks. These guys are the face of the enemy horde. These are probably the only ones to get any meaningful lines of dialogue. These will come from, they will usually be derived from the elite tier, and you'll usually give them a name and a backstory as to why they joined the villains. The player will interact with this named mook, and through them, the players will sort of get an insight into the mindset of the minions as a whole. This mook is going to be the mouthpiece for all the faceless goons that the players will encounter, so how they act is actually pretty important. If the villain's henchmen are all cruel and brutal, this named mook will probably be a lesser villain of his own accord. He's perhaps a savage officer who exemplifies all those traits valued into their comrades, where they, this villain's going to laugh. This basically lesser villain is going to laugh at weakness. He's going to kill the innocent, and they're going to act as an extension of the villain's desires. And they'll probably, at the end of the day, die in a minor boss fight, so that the players can take vengeance for some of the sins committed in the villain's name. This sort of version, though, is only one example. Maliki adds that look at the Mortar games for this, Mortar video games for this structure. Exactly. That would be exactly right. And on top of that, Nazguls would be a good example, too, of this sort of elite villain, in that they're very distinct, and the sort of presence they have is very much sort of echoes Sauron's own presence.
Or you could look at Darth Vader, because he's just basically a superpowered henchman in the original trilogy.
Well, exactly. That's the thing, is that, as I said, a villain's a named henchman will start as just a henchman, but if they're notable enough, they will basically become a character into themselves. They will grasp enough of it, And in the case of Darth Vader, yes, he became a lesser villain of his own. He became so popular, he really became the more important one. But if you actually look at the structure of the story, he was the lesser villain to the Emperor.
To the point where the officers didn't believe him and actively made fun of him behind his back.
Yeah. And once again, he represents the will of the Empire. He, the way he acts, he's very cold, decisive. He exemplifies and mirrors the Emperor's ambitions and deeds. So, there is actually a few other ways you can go with this. This mook that could also be, in a sympathetic army, or perhaps a morally conflicted one. This mook may be a morally gray actor. They may have a troubled past, or perhaps a strict code of honor that will always make them stand out to the players. Whether or not the players like this mook, they will probably end up respecting them, because the mooks will be very honor-bound. He will be probably actually keeping the rest of his people in line. And they might actually become an ally. That's an important point, is that some of these named mooks can actually become allies at the end, depending on how the game plays out. Troubled soul who's redeemed by the player. Just remember, though, whatever the path this mook takes, they are in some way reflective of the henchman horde, and by extension the villain who commands them. Whether this is because their defiance of the evil ways of the villains helps to highlight the evil villain, or if it's because their brutality emphasizes the savagery of their horde and the villain itself, they're a fun actor to write for, and many of these mooks will become player favorites. Darth Vader being a key example of this. But what I'm saying there is that if they are trying to become a morally gray, or they become good, their conflicts with the villain should highlight the villain's evil, if that makes sense. Myliki adds that he's been in the habit of having the party find hints of stronger things, but see that high-level henchman as the BBEG for at least the first leg of the campaign. Yeah, that's a perfectly fine way to do it. You can have a villain become, like, something that originally is a villain, sort of descend a little bit into being just a named mook. He can sort of move up and down the ladder as needed to. The named mook is, of course, a very sort of widespread. He covers a lot of different roles, so to speak. I'm giving a very vague sort of description of him. I've heard them called the Dragon before. I've heard them the Lieutenant. But there's a bunch of them, and they're fun to write for, to be honest. Trent, you want to add anything?
Just one more example that popped in my mind. Major Tot from Indiana Jones, Raiders of the Lost Ark. If you remember who he is.
I think so. He was the Nazi, right?
Yeah, in the black, the Gestapo agent with
Yeah, right.
it's the symbol burnt into his hand.
Yeah. And it's a good example because someone like that is going to, once again, they're going to highlight the brutality of the villain, and that's honestly great. That's one of the best things about them is and you got to remember this. If you take away anything from this when it comes to henchmen and minions' job are to emphasize the villain in some way. They will act as the villain's will, but they should also be reflective of the villain himself. That way, the players really get to sort of look forward to the villain. It builds up the villain considerably more. Like the idea earlier, as I was saying, clever villains make a clever campaign. Clever villains typically make clever minions. Not always, but it's sort of, there's going to be some sort of relationship there, and whatever that relationship is, it should work in some way to give your players something really to chew into, because you can't just immediately jump onto the villain. My leaky ads in Vecna cults, they're called different body parts: the fingers, hands, teeth, mouth, tongues, and eyes of Vecna, and that's perfect too. That's a great theme, but in this case, you need to make sure that not only do they have the naming, but they also reflect Vecna. I guess in that case, Vecna is the god. I guess he used to be a man or something. I don't remember. Vecna's weird. I don't use it much.
I mean, if you go back to the Lord of the Rings reference, you have the mouth of Sauron who appears at the Black Gate.
Yeah, as I was saying, the Nazguls, they all reflect it. They all reflect him in some way. They, like, the mouth of Sauron sort of reflects a sort of trying to convince people with honeyed words, but if you actually look at him, he's still physically repulsive. It's that sort of hard cut between someone who's supposed to be this deceiver and trickster and the actual ugliness of the character underneath. It's a nice little thing where you get a lot of different sort of personality stuff out of just just an appearance and just talk. And Myliki adds that Vecna is close in theme to Sauron. He's the demigod of shadows, the deified lich. I remember that actually. It's been a while since I've looked at him too hard, but yeah, I remember that stuff. So yeah, in that case, in Vecna's cult, there should definitely be a very close. Well, there should be something that reflects him. Whether it's his motivations, whether it's his physical appearance, whether it's his personality, whether it's his modus operandi, everything should connect together in some way. Now, let's move away from that for just a second. Is it going? Yep, it is. And let's move to one of the this is another one of the reasons why I felt I did need to start this, and because the infamous question: how to protect my villain from getting one-shotted. Trent has watched this happen before. Trent has tried to do this before.
Hell, I've had it happen to me before.
Yes, I think quite a few new DMs have gotten this happen. I've done this to a DM before. I felt terrible doing it, but it happens. And the thing is this: so the players finally reach the throne room. The evil lord stands up and prepares to take his evil speech before your battle begins. Then someone whips out a crossbow and shoots him in the head. Or the rogue sneaks up on him and slices his throat. Or any number of other incredibly stupid things happen where your players come up with some absolutely ludicrous idea or very practical idea and completely ruin the climax of your campaign. So do not fret, do not throw everything out the window. Instead, consider the following. Players are bloodthirsty buggers by nature. They will love to try and take advantage of hesitation or distraction in order to get in free damage. This can often prevent a villain, though, from providing some key piece of plot, or it can completely ruin the pacing of an entire final fight. In order to get around that, it is important to protect your villain. The classic way to do this is to include such things as taking advantage of the classic D&D rule. Talking is a free action, and letting the villain free action all over the players, in the same way the players have likely free actioned all over you many a time. You could also bind the players in your generic energy cage, force field, magical shenanigans, circle of stop doing things player, please let my villain talk, in order to restrain them while the villains get to talk off their ears. Or you could have the villain capture them and restrain them, giving them a James Bond-esque monologue while they try to escape the laser that's ever encroaching towards them. These are all okay ways to get around player bloodlust, but they're not the best ones. So, in my opinion, the first step to preventing player quick draws is to rig the encounter. If the villain is on the other side of a chasm and the bridge is out, the players are going to have a very hard time stabbing him in the back. But conversely, it may become a little harder for the players to hear out the villain if he's shouting across the gap. Not to mention, it might take a bit of the drama out if the villain is yelling across a chasm. It makes him seem a little cowardly. Easier ways might include setting up a final encounter space where the villain starts on some sort of podium or other favorable space from which the players would actually have a hard time getting to. So by using favorable positioning, the villain can talk all he wants without fear of reprisal, but you might still need some sort of defense to protect the villain from ranged attacks. And then once the villain finishes, they can descend and enter the proper battle. This will be the person, the classic Dracula at the top of the stairs talking about him. Although in that case, Richter could have whipped out a gun and shot Dracula, I guess. But the hope is that your players will settle down and listen to your monologue, because there's probably going to be something very important in there, or at the very least, get everyone hyped for battle. But it doesn't always happen. Sometimes the players do not care at all. Keeping this in mind, if you've noticed that your players are bloodthirsty and do not care about such things, don't try a monologuing villain. I'm going to tell you that right now. If your players have quick drawed and shot everyone else in the head, they're going to try and quick draw and shoot this guy in the head too. Just make sure that he ducks and covers so he doesn't get immediately shot. The final step in villain protection is the inclusion of what I like to call the player-proof vest. It's the player-proof vest is a block of health or some kind of protection that only is going to exist in your private notes, and it's only going to exist while the villain is making his opening speech. This this sort of, basically you're bending the rules here. This plot MacGuffin of sorts is going to exist just to soak up the first few hits and prevent your villain from instant death. It will mechanically occur as a lucky break, where you can hide a lethal hit behind a bunch of dice rolls where they say, I rolled to attack, and you make a bunch of rolls and say, oh, sorry, he's at the high ground, and he's got the cover, and he's got this and that. You make up excuses. This will piss off players, but it's between that and having your villain die. The other option is, of course, to have the villain, if the players decide, like a better example of a player-proof vest though, is if the players try to attack the villain during his monologue, he has some form of protection, where it's let's just say he has protection from projectiles. If the players decide to attack the villain while he's monologuing, when the players stopped attacking him, if you haven't already said he had protection from projectiles, then he suddenly doesn't have protection from projectiles. Or maybe after the players attacked him, maybe the players attacked him twice. You could say, yeah, the villain had 2 rings that would stop projectiles once each. Basically, what you're doing is you're giving a load of bull here. But the reason for it is because the thing is that if you deprive your players of that final battle, honestly, no one's gonna that final point is actually really necessary for everyone. It's cathartic. It helps to get some of that energy that you've been building out of. And at the end of the day, even if the players call you out on sort of setting up this plot-proof whatever for your villain, it will be a lot better than if the players just proceed to one-shot him because you forgot to give your villain some protection. So these protection, I'm just going to point out, these protection can also take the form of a henchman or an important minion who takes the shot for your villain, thus depriving the villain of some sort of support for the fight ahead. But regardless of what this is, this will probably cut your monologue short. So If there's any crucial information that you needed to deliver during that monologue, consider giving it in the form in the midst of the fight or as the dying last words of the villain. Players will often expect some sort of advantage from committing these first strikes, and sometimes they deserve them. If they're creative and interesting with it, they deserve some sort of reward for the first strike. It can sometimes be shortening of a boss first form if it has several forms, or give the boss some sort of handicap. If the players instead like to first strike every single guy because it's the best way to get the drop on the villain. If you then either, you at this point you should expect this and build your villain appropriately so he can take that first hit, or I don't know, you can get pissed off at your players because they're being jerks. But regardless, you can't. Well, I'm being dumb there. Don't pick a fight with your players unless they are picking a fight with you. Just protect your villains. If they really have to give that knowledge, dying breaths are a great way as well. And while it is good to reward players for the initiative, once again, don't give them free instant wins on important villains. It may be funny, but it ruins the tension and nobody feels good afterwards. Trent, you want to add anything to the point of killing off villains in one hit?
You can always do what I'm trying to do with my current character. If it gets to a certain point in the story, I'm going to have it that the final boss, I guess, can only be harmed by certain things. Not that it's an attempt to derail it, but you put a lot of work into a story, and you want to have it reach a climax. And if it just ends with the character getting shot in the head, for some people that's good, and others will be very disappointed by it. You don't want to railroad it, but making it natural. Like if people are paying attention to the story and stuff that you're putting together, reminds me of the Deadlands module or adventure, Guess Who's Coming to Donner, where the final boss can only be harmed by the ghosts of his victims, and those ghosts are being kept in bottles on a tree. So if the players have been paying attention the entire time, they would know that, and if not, they're just going to waste a bunch of bullets on it.
Yeah, that's another good way. It gives the players the opportunity to take advantage of knowledge if they've been paying attention, rewards it, and I hope in that case that the villain in that situation doesn't get one-shotted by the first bottle that hits him.
It also disincentivizes murder hoboing because your players have to actually pay attention to the world around them.
That's true. Although I will say, if your players are murder hobos by nature and you're fine with that and they're fine with that, then you can't make a complex story. That's the problem. Murder hobos are not conducive well to a complex story, or you're going to need to find something that, frankly, I don't know. That's a tough one. I've done it before in the form of notes and diaries, but not everyone likes notes and diaries. So
that's why you have a session 0 before you start running a campaign, or you lay out what the expectations of your players are.
Well, that's true. And your players also need to get the expectation of their DM. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, from there, let's move on to how to properly kill off or defeat your villain. There we go. So the boss battle is over, and now it's time to kill off your big boss, okay? Now, some people will die, inevitably in very unglorious fashions. Some people will get shot and left in a ditch, but this is the time for the big showy spectacle. In general, you should try to make this death memorable as the villains themselves. A Lord of Darkness needs to be pulled into hell by a great demon host, or he needs to explode into a pillar of evil or some such. This is important, don't just have when your villain dies, don't just write in, and then he falls to the floor dead. Give him some flair, give him some anything. His many elite villain gargoyles come down and have a silent prayer in the rafters. I don't know. It doesn't matter what it is, but every villain needs a proper send-off. if they're like your big villain. A cunning trickster maybe he falls backwards onto maybe you'll cutscene to him falling backwards onto one of his own tricks or traps and being taken down in an ironic fashion. Poetic and ironic deaths, they're always a great way to go, but really remember that much of this comes down to your personal preference as well. Whether or not the villain gets any final words, that's dependent on you, but remember to keep any such final words short and sweet, maybe no more than 3 sentences max. In some cases, death may not actually be the best option for a villain either. In the case of Magnificent Bastard, a villain who's notable for their rivalry with the players and their trickery rather than for killing people, might be better for to have the villain surrender and be arrested rather than killed. Because a lot of players are going to like to kill everything they come across, but sometimes it's important to remember that they're playing the good guys, you know? You're not murder hobos, you're more than that. Sometimes it's better to have the villain arrested or subdued rather than having the bloody ending. If you kill off the Magnificent Bastard, are you really that much better? You know? If he didn't actually kill someone and just made everyone have a hard time? It's just not, doesn't feel as good. In such cases, honestly, the reward of the villain admitting defeat will probably greatly outshine the thrill of just slaughtering the foe. And you know, actually, that's a good point in general. Whether it's a moral or ideological, that type of victory will be greatly more rewarding than any other type of victory that the players get. Whether it's that sort of revenge, or it's, you know, proving to the villain he's wrong in those last moments. Good example, Darth Vader again. The way Darth Vader has an actual moment of admitting the flaws of his own ideology, you know, basically coming back to the good side a little bit at the very end, that's a lot more rewarding than Darth Vader just falls in a hole and he's dead and that's it. So just keep these things in mind when you're writing. If there's anything else you want to add about any experiences with notable villain deaths or very disappointing villain deaths, anything come to mind?
Probably the first time Herbert was killed in our campaign.
Yeah, that'd be a good example. Where
critical role with a sling.
Yep, I made a necromancer. He came up, did his nice little monologue, and then got one-shotted immediately in the head with a sling, critical, and he was dead. And that was a good learning lesson for me. That was an important lesson in protecting my villain and in making him more, you know, durable. I think his second encounter was much better done. I don't know what do you think, Trent?
Can't remember it particularly
it's the one with
well.
The Charnel Hound. Oh, that doesn't bode well.
Was that the last one?
Yeah, that's the one you just had.
Okay, because I remember there was a middle encounter, which was a social encounter.
The middle encounter was just social and poisonings and stuff. But
no, I was just trying to place the number of it, because I remember we had like 2 or 3 encounters with him in total, but not all of them were combat related.
Fair enough. So yeah, with that little piece out of the way, I'm gonna now open up the Discord to anybody who has any Q&A questions. If you wanna, you know, jump into the chat, Trent and I will do our best to answer. If you put down a message in the Twitch chat, we'll do our best to answer. Yeah, so if you want to come in and ask us something, just hop into the tavern call, and we'll bring you in here. So otherwise, we'll take maybe 5 minutes here just to wind on down a bit, and then we'll call it. If anyone's got anything they want to add, I'll add a link to the Malik would, but he's at work. If you want to just ask us something in the comments as well, as I said, we're open for it. We'll take about 5 minutes here. I'd like to thank everyone who's actually watching the YouTube as well. Anyone who's come here from the Discord, anyone who just found this on YouTube. There wouldn't be, honestly, without you guys around, I probably wouldn't be doing this as much. So, thanks for watching. Hope this helped in some small way. And if you have any sort of, sorry about that. If you have any ideas about things you want to hear, suggestions for the stream, If you want someone else on, if then just let me know. If you want to just chat at some point, just shoot me a message. I've got plenty of time. So, with that in mind, we got about, I'll give it about 2 more minutes. I don't want to create too much dead air here at the end. Trent, anything you want to add? Just about villains in general?
Not really. I was just taking some of the downtime on my end to work on the RPG or the one shot that I've been planning on running. I've just been statting out characters.
Yeah. No.
It's in a system based around edges and hindrances, so benefits to your character and role-playing penalties.
Ah.
It's difficult determining which ones you want your villain to have because you obviously don't want them to be entirely crippling, but then the same thing is I don't want to disincentivize my players from having like crippling problems like arrogance or maybe like just trying to determine how I'm going to have it all work together because I haven't run one of these in a long time.
Okay. I think Phoenix said that he was just going to listen to it. Yeah, Phoenix was another guy I was thinking about bringing on. I'm actually going to bring him into the bestiary now. Might as well. So yeah, I think we can honestly call it here. Next time it'll probably be in about 2 weeks, and we'll probably be talking about heroes. Good stuff for character NPCs that are be assisting the hero, the main players. Stuff that the players can keep in mind that you can give them as suggestions, and just writing for the good guys in general. So this has been Hydra's Den, and I hope you all have a good day. Remember, we've got a link to the Discord in the description, and if you ever want to come on and just send us a few messages, we're always here. Thanks, and have a good day.